The morning Nora Baker walked through the door of the Fairchild ranch and announced she was going to Sunday service, something in the air shifted so violently that Matthew Fairchild felt it in his chest before he heard the words leave her lips. His eldest boy, Caleb, who was 11 years old and had not combed his hair in what Matthew suspected was a full week, stood frozen with a biscuit halfway to his mouth. His youngest, 8-year-old Eli, who had been lying on the floor arguing that church was nothing but a place where old men told you what you already knew, sat bolt upright as though lightning had struck the floorboards beneath him. "You said what?" Matthew asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Nora Baker stood in the doorway of that ranch kitchen with the morning light cutting around her in long gold ribbons, her dark hair pinned neatly at her nape, a plain blue dress smoothed against her with both hands like she was trying to appear casual about something that was anything but casual. Her brown eyes were steady, but Matthew had already learned in the 4 weeks since she had arrived at the Fairchild homestead outside of Redemption, Texas, that Nora Baker's eyes were the last things to lie. "I said I am going to church this morning," she repeated, quietly but with the sort of certainty that didn't leave room for argument. "Pastor Hale's service starts at 10. I would like to be there." Matthew's jaw tightened. He set his coffee cup down on the table with more force than he intended, and the sound rang through the kitchen like a small gunshot. There was a reason the Fairchild men did not go to church. There was a reason Matthew had not set foot inside that whitewashed building on the corner of Redemption's main road in nearly 3 years. There was a dark past buried inside those walls, a grief so sharp it still had edges that could cut him open if he looked at it directly, and Nora Baker, who had only been in his life for 4 weeks, was standing in his kitchen with her quiet brown eyes and her steady hands and announcing she was walking straight toward it. He opened his mouth to tell her she could go alone. That was what he intended to say. He absolutely intended to say it. Then Caleb scraped his chair back from the table. "I'll go," Caleb said, his voice cracking on the last word in that way it had started doing recently, half child and half something else entirely, and he was already reaching for the comb on the shelf above the wash basin. Eli stared at his brother as though Caleb had announced he intended to sprout wings. Then he looked at Nora, then back at Caleb. Then, with the particular logic of an 8-year-old who would not be left behind in anything, he scrambled to his feet and said, "Me too." Matthew Fairchild stood in his own kitchen and watched his 2 sons, the same 2 boys who had refused to attend church on every single occasion. He had gently suggested it across 3 full years, get dressed for Sunday service, because of a woman who had been in their lives for barely a month. He did not know then that this was the moment everything began to change. He did not know that what felt like the ground shifting beneath him was not destruction, but something closer to its opposite. He did not know that the dark past he was so afraid of walking back into was, in fact, the only road that led him to her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back 4 weeks, to the morning Nora Baker first arrived in Redemption, Texas, with 1 traveling trunk, 2 good dresses, a satchel full of books, and a letter of employment that had brought her across 2 states to become a housekeeper for a widower with 2 sons who needed, according to the advertisement placed in the Abilene Examiner, someone steady. The year was 1882. Redemption, Texas sat on the edge of the panhandle like something the landscape had coughed up and forgotten about. It was not a beautiful town, not in the way eastern cities were beautiful, but it had a particular kind of stark honesty to it that Nora had come to appreciate during the 3-day journey by stagecoach from Abilene. The buildings were sun-bleached timber and cracked adobe. The road was dirt that became mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. And the people were the kind of people who wore their lives right there on the surface of their skin, because they had no energy left over for pretending. Nora Baker was 26 years old, and she had been carrying a hidden motive of her own for making this trip, though she would have bristled at the word motive. She preferred necessity. She had been a schoolteacher in Abilene for 2 years following the death of her father, a man who had left her nothing but a small bookshelf, and a mountain of debts that his creditors had been very patient about up until they were not. The schoolteacher's salary had not been enough. When she had seen the advertisement, she had written back within the same afternoon. She had not expected Matthew Fairchild to be at the stage depot to meet her personally. She had expected a dour middle-aged man with a beard going to gray and the defeated posture of someone who had stopped caring what the world looked like. What she found instead was a man who stood very straight in the morning sun, whose dark hair was cut clean, whose jaw was set in a hard line that she somehow understood immediately was not cruelty but containment, like a dam holding something back. He was perhaps 33 or 34, lean in the way men who worked land were lean, with hands that showed it and eyes that showed considerably more. He had looked at her for one long moment and then looked away, as though looking at her for any longer was something he did not trust himself to do. "Miss Baker," he said, and tipped his hat. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, and extended her hand. He had shaken it briefly, then reached past her for her trunk before she could protest, and that had been essentially the full extent of the warm welcome. The ride to the ranch in the buckboard had been conducted in near total silence, which Nora had spent observing the landscape and Matthew had spent looking directly at the road ahead of them with the focused attention of a man avoiding everything else. The ranch was 2 miles outside of town, a proper spread with a main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and evidence of careful management in the state of the fences and the health of the cattle she could see grazing in the distance. The house itself was clean, but had the particular emptiness of a place where someone had stopped paying attention to comfort. There were curtains, but they were faded. There was a rug by the front door, but it needed beating. There was a fire laid in the parlor grate, but no flowers, no photographs on any surface, no personal details of the kind that tell you someone lives here rather than simply exists here. The boys had met her on the front porch. Caleb had looked at her with cool, assessing eyes that reminded her unsettlingly of his father and said nothing. Eli had looked at her with enormous round eyes and said immediately, "Are you going to make us eat vegetables every night?" "Only every other night," Nora had said, completely seriously. Eli had considered this for a moment and then decided it was acceptable. Those first 2 weeks had been careful. Matthew was polite in the distant, formal way of someone who has decided politeness is the safest territory and intends to remain in it indefinitely. He thanked her for meals. He answered direct questions. He gave her clear instructions about the household. He did not linger. He was up before dawn and working until dark, and when he came in for the evening he ate, spoke briefly and practically to his sons, and retired to the room at the end of the hall that Nora had already understood was entirely off-limits, not by any explicit instruction, but by the quality of the silence that gathered around its closed door. She had heard him once, very late at night when she could not sleep, moving around in there. The sound of boots on floorboards. The soft weight of someone sitting on a bed, and then nothing for a very long time, which somehow was worse than any sound she could have imagined. She had not asked. It was not her place to ask, and she had her own rooms she did not invite anyone into either. But she noticed things. She noticed that there were no photographs of the boy's mother anywhere in the house, not one, which was different from absence and more like deliberate erasure. She noticed that Caleb sometimes went very quiet in the evenings when the sky turned a particular shade of orange, and his eyes went somewhere far away and unreachable. She noticed that Eli never mentioned his mother at all, not once, and she had begun to suspect this was because he did not fully remember her, which was its own particular kind of grief. She noticed that Matthew, for all his carefully maintained distance, watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, and the expression on his face during those moments was one she could not quite name, something between longing and alarm. She began to win the boys over not through any grand effort, but simply by being present and consistent and genuinely interested in them. She read to Eli in the evenings from a battered copy of Jules Verne she had brought in her satchel, and the boy was immediately captivated by undersea adventures, lying on his stomach on the parlor rug with his chin in both hands. She helped Caleb with the arithmetic problems his father had set for him, and discovered that Caleb's real passion was not numbers but drawing, and she had begun quietly encouraging this, producing pencils and paper when the opportunity arose, and finding reasons to praise the careful sketches the boy left on any flat surface when he thought no one was watching. Matthew had caught her looking at one of Caleb's drawings one evening, a remarkably detailed pencil sketch of the barn and the big oak tree beside it. She had been holding it with both hands, genuinely absorbed in it, and when she looked up, Matthew was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her with that expression she could not name. "He's talented," she said simply. Matthew's jaw worked for a moment. "His mother could draw," he said, and then walked out of the kitchen so quickly that Nora was left standing alone holding the sketch, the words hanging in the air between the space where he had been and the space where she was. It was the first time he had mentioned the boy's mother. It was also the last time, for another full week. Her name, Nora eventually learned from a conversation with Caleb that had arrived unexpectedly one afternoon while they were mending a fence section together, had been Clara. She had died of a fever 3 years ago in the spring, when Eli was only 5. It had been rapid and terrible and had taken her in 4 days, and the week before she died she had been entirely fine. Caleb said this last part with the flat, careful delivery of someone who has processed a fact so many times it has worn smooth, but his eyes when he said it were not smooth at all. "Papa doesn't talk about her," Caleb said, driving a nail with more force than necessary. "Some people carry grief on the inside," Nora said carefully. "It doesn't mean they're carrying it wrong." Caleb looked at her sideways. "He doesn't go to church anymore either. He used to. We all used to go together before." And there it was, the thing she had been circling without knowing she was circling it. "Before your mother died," Nora said softly, not a question. "He thinks God didn't listen," Caleb said and drove another nail. "Or maybe he thinks he did listen and just didn't care. I don't know. Papa doesn't explain things like that." Nora had thought about this for a long time after. She had her own complicated relationship with faith. She was not a woman who wore it easily or displayed it openly, but it was there, threaded through the architecture of who she was in the way structural beams are threaded through a building, invisible but load-bearing. She had prayed for her father before he died, and he had died anyway. She had prayed for her situation in Abilene to improve, and it had not improved, not in the way she had imagined, but this job had come along, and perhaps that counted. She prayed every night in private, and she had never quite decided whether the silence she received in response was the absence of something or the presence of something she lacked the tools to properly hear. She did not bring up the church to Matthew that week. She brought up other things. She asked him about the cattle market, and he told her, briefly but with growing engagement, about the complexity of pricing and the railroad negotiations, and the particular challenges of ranching in the Panhandle region. She asked him about the history of the ranch, which his father had started, and he told her that too, more slowly, with pauses that held weight, because the ranch was part of his identity in a way that everything else had complicated, and this was the thing that remained solid. She made a pie. She had always made good pie, and this was not a thing she deployed strategically. She simply made it because she had the ingredients and she wanted to. But when she set it on the table after dinner one evening and Eli made a sound that could only be described as reverent, and even Caleb smiled, she looked up and found Matthew looking at the pie, and then at her with an expression that had gone very soft at its edges. And she looked quickly back down at the table because the expression felt like something too private to witness. The third week was when things began to shift in ways she had not planned for. It happened on a Wednesday, during a thunderstorm that came in fast from the northwest and trapped everyone inside the house for the better part of the afternoon. The boys played cards while Nora sat in the parlor reading, and Matthew, who had been intending to ride out to check on the north pasture cattle, had come back inside with rain on his hat and a frustrated set to his shoulders, and had simply, for lack of other options, sat down in the armchair across from her. She had kept reading for a little while and he had done nothing, just sat there in the armchair with his long legs extended and his arms resting on the chair's arms, looking at the fire. She had the distinct impression he did not know what to do with stillness, that it made him uncomfortable in the way trapped animals are uncomfortable, not dangerous but tightly wound. She lowered her book. "Have you read Jules Verne?" she asked. He blinked, looked at her. "No. Your son is entirely captivated. I've been reading it aloud to him in the evenings." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "I know, I've heard you." She had not known he could hear her from the end of the hall, and the knowledge that he had been listening night after night, from behind that closed door, produced a warmth in her chest that she was not entirely certain how to categorize. "What do you read?" she asked. "Cattle prices," he said, and there was the faintest thing at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile if it had been given another half-second to develop, but it didn't get the time. "That's not what I meant, and I think you know it," she said, returning to her book. There was a pause, and then, to her great surprise, he said, "I used to read history before." Another pause. Clara liked history too. She had a whole shelf of it. She did not point out that the shelf must have been removed along with every other trace of Clara. She said, "What period?" "American, the Revolution mostly." He hesitated. "And the war?" She read about the war. He meant the Civil War. The one that had ended 17 years ago and remade the country and left permanent marks on everyone who had lived through it, particularly here in Texas where the marks were still visible if you knew where to look. "Were you in it?" she asked carefully. "I was 14 when it ended, too young." "Your father," his jaw tightened. "He rode with Hood, came back a beat. Changed." She understood what changed meant in that context. She had seen changed men in Abilene, a dozen years on from the war and still carrying things they could not put down. "I'm sorry," she said. "He managed," Matthew said. "The land helped. I think the land always helps." She looked at him for a moment. There was so much in those words, so much more than he seemed to realize he was saying, about how he handled his own grief, about where he had put himself in the 3 years since Clara died, how he had submerged himself in the physical work of the ranch and the land, and let it hold him when he could not hold himself. It was not a criticism. She understood it completely. But she also saw its limitation, which was that land cannot hold a person back the way another person can. She did not say any of this. She went back to her book. But that evening after dinner, when the storm had cleared and the air outside smelled like wet earth and new beginnings, Matthew came into the kitchen while she was washing the dishes, and without a word picked up a dish towel and began drying them, and they stood at the counter together in the yellow lamplight doing this simple domestic thing, not speaking, and the silence between them was entirely different from the silence of the first 2 weeks. It had warmth in it now. The 4th week was the week everything accelerated in ways neither of them had expected. There was a man in town named Gerald Hartwick. He was a lawyer of the particularly unpleasant variety, the kind who had arrived in a new territory with ambitions that were inversely proportional to his scruples. He had been trying to acquire land in the area for the better part of 2 years, representing a railroad land speculation group out of Fort Worth, and Matthew Fairchild's ranch, situated as it was along what would be the ideal route for the proposed southern spur of the Texas and Pacific extension, was the most desirable piece of property he had not yet managed to get his hands on. Hartwick came to the ranch on a Tuesday. Nora was the one who answered the door, which clearly he had not expected. He was a wide man in a city suit that was expensive and entirely wrong for the climate, with small gray eyes that made a rapid assessment of her and then dismissed her in the same motion. "I'm here to see Fairchild," he said. "Mr. Fairchild is working," Nora said. "I can take a message." "I'll wait." "You are welcome to wait on the porch," Nora said, and closed the door to the distance of courtesy but not invitation, and went to find Matthew. She watched the meeting from the kitchen window, not close enough to hear every word but close enough to read the body language, and what she read was: Hartwick was presenting something as an opportunity that was actually a trap, and Matthew knew it and was keeping his temper with considerable effort. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. At the end of it, Matthew shook his head once firmly, and Hartwick left with his city suit and his small gray eyes and his paper still in his hand. Matthew came inside and stood in the kitchen with his hands on the edge of the counter and his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders like cables pulled too tight. "He's been circling this land for 2 years," he said without turning around. "I could see that," she said. "What does he want?" "The West pasture, claims the railroad needs it for right-of-way. He's offering a price that sounds reasonable until you understand what the land is worth." He turned around. His eyes were dark and his jaw was the hardest she had seen it. "It's my father's land, my son's land." "Then don't sell it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, something flickering in his expression. "It's not always that simple. The railroad has legal means. Friends in Austin." He paused. "I need a lawyer. Do you have one?" "Closest one I trust is in Abilene." He rubbed the back of his neck. "This could take time and money I'd rather be spending elsewhere." "I can write letters," Nora said. "I was a teacher, I write well. If you need correspondence, formal correspondence to counter what Hartwick files, I can help with that." He stared at her. Then he said slowly, "Why would you do that?" The question was not ungrateful. It was genuinely puzzled, in the way of someone who has grown unaccustomed to being helped, and has forgotten that it is a thing that sometimes simply happens between people who occupy the same space long enough. "Because it's unjust," she said, "and I have the skill to address it, and those seem like sufficient reasons to me." He went on looking at her. Then he nodded once and said, "All right." What followed was 3 evenings of working at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, the lamp between them, Nora with paper and pen and Matthew with the relevant documents and his own particular knowledge of the situation, constructing legal correspondence with enough precise language to give pause to anyone reading it. They worked well together, she discovered. He was clear and precise about facts, and she was skilled at framing those facts in language that had both clarity and weight. And there was something almost dangerously comfortable about sitting across that table from him in the lamplight, their heads occasionally bent close over the same page. On the second evening, Eli had appeared at the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, having woken from a dream, and Matthew had gone to him without hesitation and carried him back to bed. And Nora had heard the low murmur of Matthew's voice through the wall, talking his son back to sleep, and she had sat at the kitchen table with her pen in her hand, and felt something move through her chest that she recognized with a start as tenderness, deep and unambiguous. On the third evening, when they had finished and she was gathering the papers into order, Matthew said quietly, "You didn't have to do this." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The boys like you," he said, and from his tone she understood this was not a simple statement. It was an admission of something larger, something he was approaching indirectly because the direct approach was more vulnerability than he currently had access to. "I like them," she said, equally simply. The lamp was low, and the night outside was full of cricket noise and distant wind, and Matthew Fairchild sat across the table from her looking at her, with that expression she had been unable to name for 4 weeks, and she finally named it now in the privacy of her own mind. It was the expression of a man who has decided he has no right to want something and has been continuously blindsided by the discovery that he wants it anyway. She looked back at him, and then looked down at the papers and stood up and said good night and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. She was not, she told herself firmly, in a position to complicate this. She was employed here. He was a man still wrapped around a grief she could not fully see. She had her own debts and her own dark past, and the particular kind of wariness that came from having depended on people who had not been dependable. She could not afford to mistake kindness and proximity for something deeper. She could not afford, in any meaningful sense, to be wrong about Matthew Fairchild. She was still having this conversation with herself 4 days later, on Sunday morning, when she woke up before dawn and lay in bed listening to the still house, and felt with sudden clarity that she needed the particular kind of quiet that she had always found in church. Not performance, not obligation. Something more like placing yourself inside a space where the weight of things can be briefly shared with something larger than yourself. She got dressed. She went to the kitchen and made breakfast. And when the boys came in with their usual morning energy and their usual resistance to anything that resembled organization, she said, calmly and without making it a big thing, that she was going to church this morning and she would be leaving at 9:30. She had not said it as an invitation. She had said it as a statement of her own intentions, because she had learned early that she could not claim her own needs as requests and expect them to be taken seriously. She simply stated what she was going to do, the way a person with the right to their own choices states it. She had not expected the boys to respond the way they did. Now here they were, 3/4 of an hour later, standing in the yard of the Fairchild ranch in the clear Sunday morning air, 2 boys dressed in their best and a woman in her blue dress, and Matthew Fairchild standing in the doorway of his own house, wearing the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a force he did not anticipate and is not entirely certain how he feels about it. Caleb looked at his father. Eli looked at his father. Nora looked at no one in particular, adjusting her hat pin with great focus. "Well," Matthew said finally. "We'll be late if we don't leave soon," Nora said, looking at the sun. He stood in that doorway for another long moment. She did not look at him directly. She was not going to make this harder than it needed to be, but she was also not going to make it easier by giving him an excuse not to come. She simply waited, with her hands folded and her posture entirely neutral, and left the silence for him to fill. She heard him go back inside. She heard, a few minutes later, the sounds of boots and a belt buckle. She kept her eyes on the road. When he came out, he was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and his expression was locked down so tight she could have believed he felt nothing, except that his eyes, as he passed her to reach the buckboard, flicked to her face for one swift, unguarded second. She climbed up beside him on the buckboard seat without comment. The boys scrambled into the back. Matthew gathered the reins. The horses moved out onto the road toward Redemption, and for the first 1/4 mile nobody said a word. Then Eli said from the back, "Is the sermon going to be long?" "Hush," Caleb said. "I'm just asking." "It will be as long as it needs to be," Nora said. "That's not really an answer," Eli said. Matthew, who had been staring with iron focus at the road, made a sound. Nora was almost certain it was the very early ancestor of a laugh, quickly suppressed, and she felt the warmth move through her again, that tenderness she had no business feeling, and she looked very carefully out at the flat yellow-green landscape on the other side of the road. Redemption's church was a white building with a modest bell tower, situated at the corner of First Street and Harper Road, where it had sat since 1874. The bell was ringing as they pulled up, which meant they were just in time, and people were filing through the front door in their Sunday best. Several of them looked up with open curiosity at the Fairchild buckboard, and Nora saw the quick whispered conversations, the exchanged glances, the particular communicative efficiency of a small town that knows everyone's business, including the business they're supposed to pretend not to know. Matthew helped her down from the buckboard without comment, his hand briefly at her elbow, and then he was greeting a few people by name with the clipped, polite acknowledgement of someone who is going to get through this if it kills him. She watched him shake hands with a man named Cole Whitaker, who was the town's feed merchant and apparently an old acquaintance, and she watched Cole Whitaker look at Matthew with open surprise, and then look at her with an expression of rapidly assembled understanding. She lifted her chin slightly and walked into the church. Pastor Hale was a spare, serious man in his 50s with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that Nora appreciated immediately. The interior of the church was simple and clean, whitewashed walls and plain pews and morning light coming through windows that had no colored glass, just clear light, unfiltered. They took a pew near the back, the four of them, boys in the middle, and Nora sat straight with her hands in her lap and let the familiar smell of the place, wood and candle wax, and something that was just the accumulation of years of people sitting in the same space seeking something, settle around her like a hand on her shoulder. She did not look at Matthew during the service, but she was aware of him beside her with a physical awareness that she found difficult to categorize as anything other than what it was. Pastor Hale's sermon was about forgiveness. Not the performative kind, the kind you announce, but the quiet, private kind, the kind you have to choose repeatedly and often without reward. He talked about carrying grief as though it is a punishment for something you could have done differently, and about the particular trap of believing that releasing grief means betraying the person you are grieving. He did not look at Matthew Fairchild while he said these things. He looked at the whole congregation with equal steadiness. But Nora felt the pew beside her go very still. After the service, in the yard outside where people gathered and talked and children ran, and the morning light was warm and generous, Eli immediately found another boy his age and disappeared into a game involving a fence post that Nora decided not to examine too closely. Caleb stood near the buckboard with his hands in his pockets, watching everything with those assessing eyes, and she moved to stand beside him. "What did you think?" she asked. "It was all right," Caleb said, which from him was something close to enthusiasm. He was quiet for a moment. "He was talking about Papa," he said then, very quietly. "I think he was talking about a lot of people," Nora said carefully. Caleb looked up at her. He was 11 years old and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's ability to draw, and he was carrying things no 11-year-old should have to carry. And for a moment, Nora wanted to put her arms around him, but she waited because she had learned that Caleb needed to come to things in his own time. "Mama would have liked you," Caleb said, and looked back at the yard. Nora did not say anything for a moment because her throat had gone somewhat uncertain. "That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me," she managed. He shrugged, in the way of someone who has delivered an important truth and is now embarrassed by the delivery. "I'm just saying." Across the yard, Matthew was being spoken to by Pastor Hale. She could see them from here, the pastor speaking quietly and Matthew listening with his hat in his hands and his head slightly bowed. And whatever the pastor was saying was landing somewhere in Matthew that showed in his posture, in the careful way he stood, like something was being allowed to be set down. She looked away. She found a woman to introduce herself to, a pleasant rancher's wife named Helen Cole, who welcomed her warmly and seemed delighted to have someone new to talk to. And they had a lively conversation about the difficulties of managing a household without a reliable supply of decent flour, which segued into a discussion about the territorial politics and the land speculation problem that was apparently affecting several families in the area, and not just the Fairchilds. "Hartwick," Helen said, with the particular firmness of a woman who has no patience for men who cause problems. "He's been at it for 2 years. My husband says the railroad lawyers are very clever about the way they structure the legal claims so that by the time the regular courts look at it, it appears entirely legitimate. We've been preparing correspondence," Nora said. "Mr. Fairchild intends to file a formal counterclaim." Helen looked at her with interest. "You helped him write it." "I did," Helen smiled. "Good," she said simply and with warmth. The ride home was different from the ride there. Still not full of conversation, but different in its quality. Eli talked for most of it, which covered the silence requirements adequately, reporting on the fence post game and the boy he had met named Daniel, whose father apparently had a horse that was the fastest horse in the territory, and could Eli please meet this horse. And Matthew said they would see, which from him meant probably yes, and Eli seemed satisfied with that. Caleb sat looking out at the landscape and said nothing, but he was sitting closer to Nora's side of the buckboard than he had been before, close enough that his shoulder occasionally touched her arm, and he did not move away when it did. Matthew drove and was quiet, and once, only once, He glanced sideways at her and she caught it, and this time she did not look away. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and what passed between them in those seconds was something neither of them had the words for yet. But it was real and it was there and it had been there for some time, and they had both stopped pretending otherwise. That afternoon, while the boys were occupied with their own activities, and the ranch had the drowsy Sunday quiet of a place that has been permitted to rest, Nora was in the kitchen garden when she heard Matthew behind her. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the garden, hat off, turning it in his hands in that way he had when he was working up to saying something. "The pastor said something to me this morning," Matthew said. She waited. "He said that Clara would not have wanted the boys to grow up without faith." He paused. "He said a lot of things, but that was the one that he started again. She was the one who took them every week. She was the one who made it important. When she died, I thought if God wasn't going to," he stopped again, jaw working. "It felt like a betrayal to go back. To go back to a place that hadn't answered," Nora said softly. "Yes." His eyes came up to hers. "Something like that." She thought about what to say. She thought about the easy things, the comforting things, and decided they were not what he needed. What he needed was honesty. "I don't know why some prayers aren't answered the way we want them to be," she said. "I've had my own. I've had a lot of silence where I expected an answer. But I don't think the silence means the same thing as nothing. And I don't think going back to church is a betrayal of Clara. I think," she paused, choosing carefully, "I think it might be a way of honoring what she valued." He was very still. "Caleb told me she would have liked me," Nora added, more quietly. Matthew looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was not the lockdown-contained one she was accustomed to. It was open, and it was raw, and it was something she recognized with a quickening of her own breath as being very close to the feeling she had been trying not to name in her own chest for 4 weeks. "Caleb's right," Matthew said. The words were quiet. The words were absolutely certain. And they stood in the kitchen garden in the afternoon light, and he looked at her with everything in his face finally uncovered, and she thought, here it is. Here is the thing that has been building. He took a step toward her, and she did not step back. He was close enough now that she could see the faint line where the sun had weathered his skin along his jaw, could see the way his eyes were not purely dark but had threads of warm brown in them in this light. "Nora," he said, and he had never said her given name before. It had always been Miss Baker, careful and appropriate, and the sound of just her name in his voice did something to the air between them. "Matthew," she said. He put his hand out very slowly and touched her hand where it rested at her side, not grasping, just touching, his fingers over hers, and they stood like that for a moment that was completely still. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, which she suspected was the most honest thing he had said in 3 years. "Neither do I," she said. "I think that might be all right." He turned his hand over and held hers properly then, and they stood in the garden in the Sunday afternoon light, holding hands, in the simple, impossible fact of 2 people who had found each other without expecting to. The following week brought complications that neither of them had expected. Gerald Hartwick returned. He came not to the ranch this time, but to Nora directly, encountering her in town on Thursday when she had come in to collect supplies. He materialized beside her at the mercantile counter with his small gray eyes and his city suit and a friendliness that did not reach anywhere above his collar. "Miss Baker," he said, "I understand you've been helping Fairchild with his legal paperwork." She turned and looked at him calmly. "That's not something I'd discuss with someone I haven't been introduced to properly," she said. "Gerald Hartwick, I'm sure you've heard the name," he smiled. "I want you to understand something. Fairchild's position is not as strong as he believes it is. The railroad has claims that will hold up in court. The best thing for him and for those boys would be to take the settlement and negotiate a good price. I'm sure Mr. Fairchild is capable of making that determination himself," Nora said. "He's a stubborn man. He might need someone to help him see reason, someone he trusts." The implication in Hartwick's voice was perfectly clear, and it made her skin feel cold. She held his gaze for a full 3 seconds. "Mr. Hartwick," she said, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Nothing you could say to me will result in me working against Matthew Fairchild's interests. If that is what you came here to suggest, I would advise you to take your suggestion and go back to wherever you came from. Hartwick looked at her for a moment. The friendliness disappeared from his face like water off a slope. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I rarely do," she said, and turned back to the counter. She told Matthew about it that evening, not hiding it, not softening it, simply telling him what had happened because he needed to know. She watched his face go through several things rapidly as she spoke. When she finished, he was very quiet for a moment. "He tried to use you against me," he said flatly. "He suggested it. I declined." Matthew looked at her. "You could have just said nothing. You didn't have to. I told you," she said firmly. "I'm not going to work against your interests. That is not what I'm here for, and it is not who I am." He looked at her for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "I know exactly who you are." And the way he said it, with the certainty of a man who has arrived at a conclusion that has been building for a long time, made her breath come slower for a moment. He went to Abilene the following week, personally, to meet with the lawyer he trusted, a man named Samuel Price, who had been handling land disputes in the region for a decade. He was gone 3 days, and the ranch was hers and the boys' for those 3 days, and she ran it with quiet competence, and the boys were good for her in the way children are good for people they have decided they trust. Eli asked her on the second evening, "Are you going to stay?" She was drying dishes, and she stopped for a moment. "I'm employed here," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked," Eli said with the piercing directness of 8-year-olds everywhere. "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him, this small, serious boy with his father's dark eyes and his quick mind and his enormous questions. "I want to," she said honestly. Eli nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his book. When Matthew came back from Abilene, he brought the news that Samuel Price had reviewed their correspondence and the land claim documentation and believed they had a solid case, but it would require filing in Austin and potentially a long process. He also brought Eli a book about undersea exploration, which Eli received with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. And he brought Caleb a proper set of drawing pencils in a wooden case, which Caleb looked at for a full 30 seconds before looking up at his father with an expression that said everything he would not let himself say in words. He brought Nora a small package too, which he handed to her that evening in the kitchen with a casualness that was clearly performed. She opened it. It was a small volume, hardbound blue cloth, History of the American Revolution. She looked up at him. "You said you'd been a teacher," he said. "I thought maybe you'd like." He stopped. "Clara's history books were the only ones I couldn't." Another stop. "The shelf is empty. I thought it was time to put something back on it." She held the book in both hands and looked at it and did not trust her voice for a moment. "Thank you," she managed. "Matthew." He nodded, still with that performed casualness, and went to help Eli with something. And she stood in the kitchen holding the book and understood that what had just happened was not a small gesture. It was the most significant thing she could have been given, not the book itself, but what its presence on that shelf represented. The first thing put back into a space that had been deliberately emptied, the first small act of allowing the world to be inhabited again. She put it on the shelf that evening, and it stood there alone, and it was the beginning of something. 3 weeks later, on a warm October Sunday, the Fairchild family went to church again, all 4 of them. And this time it was not a surprise, it was simply what they did. Matthew drove the buckboard and Eli talked, and Caleb sketched in his small notebook he had taken to carrying everywhere, and Nora sat on the seat beside Matthew with the morning sun on her face and his shoulder warm beside her. In the churchyard afterward, Helen Cole appeared at Nora's side with a knowing smile. "He's looking at you again," she murmured. Nora did not look around to confirm this. She was entirely aware of it without needing to look. "Is he?" she said. "Half the town has noticed," Helen said cheerfully. "Helen, I'm just saying." Helen patted her arm. "It's good to see." "It's been a long 3 years for that family." She looked at Nora more seriously. It's good to see him coming back." "He did that himself," Nora said. You showed up," Helen said. "Sometimes that's the whole thing." On the drive home, while Eli had fallen asleep against Caleb's shoulder and Caleb was looking determinedly out at the passing landscape as though he had not noticed his brother leaning on him, Matthew spoke quietly. "Nora." "Yes. I want to ask you something." The quality in his voice made her go very still. She kept her eyes ahead. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as an employee." He paused. She could feel the effort it was costing him. "I'm not good at saying things like this. I've been out of practice for a long time, but I think you know what I'm trying to say." She did know. She had known for some time. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she asked quietly because she was a direct person and she needed to be certain they were talking about the same thing. A pause. "Yes," he said. She looked at the road. She thought about what to say, not because she did not know her answer, but because the answer deserved to be said properly and not with her heart going so fast she could barely think. "I came here with a hidden motive," she said. He turned to look at her. "What?" "Not a bad one," she said quickly. "Just I needed to get out of Abilene. I needed the money. I needed a change. I didn't come here for this. I didn't plan it." "Neither did I," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him. "I want you to know that what I feel is real. It's not about the security or the position or any of that. If you had been a different man, I would have done my job and that would have been all." He held her gaze for a moment. The buckboard swayed. Behind them, Eli mumbled something in his sleep. "I know that," Matthew said. "I know who you are." "Then yes," she said. The words settled into the morning air between them and both of them were quiet for a long moment. Not from awkwardness, but from the particular fullness of a moment that has been worth the waiting. Matthew reached over and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and held it, and drove the rest of the way home one-handed, which she suspected was not entirely safe on the uneven road, and she did not say a word about it. They told the boys that evening, after dinner in the parlor. Nora had wanted to do this properly, not as an announcement but as a conversation, and Matthew had agreed, and they sat together on the parlor settee with Caleb and Eli across from them in the two armchairs, which reversed the usual arrangement and made it feel appropriately significant. Eli, when they had said what they were saying, sat forward immediately. "Does that mean you're our mother now?" he asked, looking at Nora with enormous eyes. She felt the question land in her chest like something precious and heavy. "It means I'm going to be your papa's wife," she said carefully. "And I'm going to be here, every day, for as long as you'll have me." "That's the same thing," Eli said with complete confidence. Caleb said nothing for a moment. He was looking at his hands, at the small ink stains from his drawing pencils. Then he looked up and looked at Nora directly with his father's eyes and said, "Are you happy?" The question surprised her. She answered it honestly. "Very," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. And that was all he said, but it was enough. They were married 6 weeks later, in December of 1882, in the church on the corner of First Street and Harper Road, the same church Matthew had not entered for 3 years before Nora Baker arrived, and on a clear Sunday morning, simply stated she was going. Pastor Hale performed the ceremony with quiet dignity. Helen Cole was there with her husband. Samuel Price had ridden up from Abilene specifically and stood in the back with his hat in his hands and a broad smile. The boys were both dressed in their best and stood on either side of their father at the front of the church. Eli with bright eyes and barely contained excitement. Caleb with a careful, wondering expression that broke open into a real smile when Nora came down the aisle in her good dress, with a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Eli had assembled with considerable personal investment. Nora Baker walked down the aisle of that simple white church by herself. No hand on her arm, no father to give her away, just herself and her own choice and the full weight of her own life behind her. And she looked at Matthew Fairchild standing at the front with his sons beside him and his eyes on her face with an expression that was nothing like containment now. And she thought, this is what it is to be entirely in the right place. The ceremony was brief and real. When Pastor Hale asked the words and Matthew said, "I do," His voice was steady and clear and carried to the back of the church. When Nora said her words, she looked directly at Matthew the entire time. He kissed her briefly and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart going fast. "Good to know," she murmured. "Hush," he said, and kissed her again, and Eli made a very loud sound of approval that made the whole church laugh. The land dispute with Hartwick and the railroad went to the Austin courts in January and was resolved by April in Matthew's favor, thanks to Samuel Price's careful preparation and the documentation that Nora and Matthew had assembled together on those 3 evenings at the kitchen table. Hartwick relocated his operations to another county shortly afterward, which the people of Redemption received with collective satisfaction. The ranch prospered. The spring of 1883 was a good one, with adequate rain and strong cattle prices, and Matthew began expanding the herd in a careful, methodical way that reflected his particular approach to everything, deliberate and considered and ultimately effective. He also, at Nora's suggestion, and with Caleb's enthusiastic cooperation, cleared out a small room at the back of the house and turned it into a proper space for Caleb to draw in, with a north-facing window for good light. Caleb spent every spare hour in it. Nora put more books on the history shelf. Matthew found some too, on trips to Abilene, and the shelf filled slowly with the comfortable accumulation of a shared life. There was still a photograph on the mantel now, just one, a small daguerreotype that had been in the box at the back of Matthew's wardrobe for 3 years. It was Clara. He had taken it out one evening and stood looking at it for a long time, and then he had put it on the mantel, and Nora had looked at it and thought she could see something of Caleb in the set of the eyes. "She should be here," Nora said. "Yes," Matthew said. "She should." He was quiet for a moment. But she would have wanted them to be happy. She would have wanted all of this. Nora stood beside him and put her hand on his arm, and they looked at the photograph together, and it was not a sad moment. It was a full one, the way true things are full. On a warm evening in June, Nora told Matthew she was expecting. They were on the porch in the long evening light, the kind of June evenings that made even the Panhandle landscape look beautiful, all that wide sky going amber and violet. Matthew had his coffee and she had her book, and they had been sitting in the comfortable silence of people who no longer need to fill silences to feel connected. She said it quietly and directly because she had learned that this was always the best way. He put his coffee cup down very slowly, turned to look at her. And the expression on his face was one she had never seen on it before, something that was wonder and terror in equal measure, the specific face of a person encountering joy so large they don't immediately know where to put it. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said. He took her hand. He held it in both of his, the way you hold something you want to be careful with. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Somewhat unsettled in the mornings," she said. "Generally excellent otherwise." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid," which was the most honest thing she had heard from him since "I don't know what I'm doing in the kitchen garden." "Of what?" "Of," he stopped. "Last time. With Clara it went fine, and then, I don't want to," he could not finish the sentence. "Matthew," she said, "I know, I understand, but I cannot promise you certainty. Nobody can give you certainty. What I can tell you is that I am strong and healthy and that we are going to face this together whatever comes." She paused. "And what is coming, I believe very strongly, is a baby who is going to complete this family in the most wonderful way possible." He looked at her for a long time. He raised her hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles, a gesture so quiet and certain that it reached right into the center of her. "Together," he agreed. They told the boys the next morning at breakfast. Eli received this information with the immediate practical question of whether the baby could sleep in his room, which he said with such earnestness that it was clearly not a display but an actual proposal. They told him they would think about it. Caleb put his fork down and looked at both of them with those careful, assessing eyes, and then said slowly, "I'll look out for it." Not him or her. It. Caleb had already decided the baby was under his protection before it had arrived. Nora looked at this 11-year-old boy and felt something expand in her chest to a size that was almost painful. The pregnancy was good. healthful, and progressing without complication through the summer and into the fall. Though Nora was honest with herself that she watched every morning with careful attention for anything alarming and prayed every night with a fervor that was perhaps less dignified than her usual approach. Matthew was attentive in the particular way of someone who is managing fear by transforming it into action, ensuring she did not lift anything heavy, riding into town herself for the supplies rather than sending the boys, checking in on her at intervals that were almost more regular than she required, but that she allowed because she understood where they came from. He also, in September, had a conversation with the midwife in town, a capable woman named Mrs. Graves, who had delivered half the children born in the Redemption region for 20 years, and came home from this conversation with a much calmer expression than he had left with, which suggested Mrs. Graves had handled him with the same practical firmness she presumably applied to everything. The baby was born on a February morning in 1884, into a world that was cold and brilliant with winter light, in the upstairs bedroom of the Fairchild Ranch with Mrs. Graves in attendance, and Matthew downstairs performing the time-honored role of a man who has been told to wait, and is doing it badly. Nora was not afraid. She was intensely focused, the way she was always focused when something important needed to be done, and Mrs. Graves said afterward, with the appreciation of a woman who had seen every kind of response to labor, that Nora Fairchild was the most sensible patient she had ever attended. When Mrs. Graves opened the door at the top of the stairs and told Matthew he could come up, he took the stairs fast enough that Nora heard them and almost smiled despite everything. He came into the room and she was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and the baby was red and indignant and very present, and his eyes went straight to the baby, and then to her, and the expression on his face completed everything she had ever thought about what this man was capable of when he allowed himself to be fully open. "Boy," Mrs. Graves said from the doorway. 7 pounds and his lungs work perfectly. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed beside Nora, and she put the baby into his arms without hesitation, and he held his son with the careful, certain competence of a man who has done this before and who remembers that it matters, and looked at the baby's face, and Nora watched his throat move. "Hello," Matthew said to the baby, very quietly. "We've been expecting you." They named him James after Matthew's father. James Henry Fairchild, who immediately established himself as a person of strong opinions and significant volume, to Eli's enormous delight and Caleb's quiet fascination. The house, already warmer than it had been a year ago, became warmer still with this new small presence in it, and Nora recovered quickly and was up and managing again within a week, which Mrs. Graves noted approvingly, and Matthew accepted with relief, and Eli celebrated by reading the first chapter of a new book to baby James on the grounds that it was never too early to start. Spring came again, as it had come the spring before and the one before that, with the particular generosity of a Texas spring that makes the whole hard year feel worth it. Grass going green and the sky enormous, and the cattle fat and the ranch running well, and the fence standing solid against the panhandle wind. They went to church on Sundays, all of them. This was just the thing they did. Pastor Hale had married them and baptized James and would confirm Caleb the following year, and the church on the corner of First and Harper was part of their life now, not because they had been told to, but because they had chosen it, which was the only kind of belonging that ever meant anything. Caleb turned 12 that spring, and his drawings were increasingly remarkable, detailed, careful work that showed an eye for composition that was genuinely unusual. A rancher from a neighboring county who visited the Fairchild spread that summer saw one of Caleb's pieces on the kitchen wall, a detailed charcoal drawing of the ranch from the ridge above, and asked to purchase it. Caleb, after a long consultation with his father, sold it for $2, which he held in his hand with the expression of someone who has just understood something important about the relationship between ability and the world. "You could do this," Matthew told him that evening. "For a life, eventually, "If you wanted." Caleb looked at his father for a long time. "Can I do that and still help on the ranch?" "As long as the ranch needs you," Matthew said. "But the ranch doesn't need you to sacrifice everything else." It was exactly the right thing to say, and they both knew it. Eli turned 9 that autumn and went from being interested in books to being interested in horses with the comprehensive conversion of a 9-year-old who has found his thing, spending every available hour with the animals and demonstrating a natural ease with them that Matthew watched with quiet satisfaction. He arranged for Eli to help with the horses properly, not just watching but working, learning the care and handling that was the real foundation of everything. Nora was expecting again by the following spring. She told Matthew on a Sunday morning before church, standing in the kitchen while he was fixing his collar in the small mirror by the door, and he turned around and looked at her with those warm, dark eyes and smiled, which was a thing he did much more readily now, and which still produced in her a specific and unfailing warmth. "Good," he said, and crossed the kitchen and kissed her in a way that made her have to remind herself the boys might come downstairs at any moment. The second baby was another boy, born in November of 1885, small and dark-haired and immediately fascinated by everything, named Samuel for the lawyer who had helped save the ranch. Samuel Price Fairchild, who was called Sam and who proved from his earliest months to be a person of remarkable curiosity, reaching for everything in his vicinity with both hands and a look of intense scientific interest. The house was full now, genuinely full, with the particular aliveness of a space inhabited by people who want to be there. The history shelf was crowded with books. Caleb's drawings were on the walls of every room. Eli's boots were always in the wrong place by the door. James learned to walk and immediately applied this new skill to getting into everything within reach. Sam observed the household from his blanket with the alert eyes of someone collecting data. And in the evenings, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Matthew and Nora sat on the porch in the seasons when the evenings were warm enough, and inside by the fire when they weren't, and talked. About the ranch and the boys and the books they were reading. About history, which Nora had continued to love and which Matthew had come back to with a kind of gratitude, as though it was something that had waited for him to be ready to return. About Clara occasionally, because she was part of the story and not speaking of her was no longer necessary or right. About the future, which was a thing Matthew had stopped looking at clearly for 3 years and could now look at with something that was not quite certainty. No one ever really has that, but was very close to hope. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1887, when James was 3, and Sam was 18 months, and Eli was 12, and Caleb was 15, and the Fairchild Ranch was prospering in a way that would have been difficult to predict in the dark winter of 1882, Nora came downstairs dressed for church and found all 4 of her men in the kitchen at various stages of ready. Which was such a complete inversion of the scene from 5 years ago that she stood in the doorway for a moment just taking it in. Caleb was helping James with his small shoes, bent over patiently while James tried to walk away mid-lace. Eli was eating a biscuit with one hand and combing his hair with the other with the particular efficiency of a 12-year-old who has learned to manage time to maximum biscuit advantage. Sam was in the high chair Matthew had built, eating porridge with the enthusiastic imprecision of the very young, and Matthew was in the process of making more coffee and turned when she appeared in the doorway and looked at her with those warm, dark eyes and a smile that was entirely for her. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. It was, she thought, the simplest and most complete word in the language for what they had all become. They drove to church that morning in the wagon that was bigger than the buckboard now, because they needed the room, James on her lap and Sam tucked against Matthew's arm while he drove, Caleb and Eli in the back arguing companionably about something she could not hear over the wind. The bell was ringing as they pulled up, the same bell, the same white building, the same clear morning light coming through the uncolored windows, and the Fairchild family climbed down and went inside together. Nora sat between Matthew and Caleb with James on her knee and Sam working his way steadily toward sleep against her arm, and Matthew's hand found hers on the pew between them and held it, loosely, easily, the way you hold something you are not afraid of losing because you know exactly what it is and what it means and where it lives. Pastor Hale preached that morning about belonging. About how belonging is not something you are born into automatically, but something you choose repeatedly, with your daily decisions and your daily presence and your daily willingness to return to the people and places that ask something of you. About how the act of showing up is itself a form of faith, in people, in community, in the possibility that showing up matters. Nora listened and looked at the clear light through the windows and thought about a morning 5 years ago when she had stood in a ranch kitchen doorway and announced, simply and quietly, that she was going to church. She had not known then what a small act could set in motion. She had not known that the single fact of her intention to do one ordinary faithful thing would be the thing that brought two boys off the floor and away from the table and into their best clothes, and would bring their father, with all his grief and his containment and his hidden capacity for love, out of a 3-year stillness and into the moving world. She had just known she wanted to go. She had just stated what she wanted, clearly and without apology, and let the rest follow. Beside her, Matthew squeezed her hand gently, the particular pressure that between them meant simply, "Here, I am here," which was everything. After the service, in the yard where the spring light was warm and generous, and Eli had already disappeared with Daniel, whose father's allegedly fast horse had long since been assessed and determined to be genuinely fast, and Caleb was showing James how to pick up a stick correctly while James mostly wanted to chew on it, and Sam had woken up and was looking around at the world with his bright collector's eyes. Matthew stood beside Nora with his hat in his hand and looked out over the small community of redemption going about its Sunday morning. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. She looked at him. "For what?" "For that first Sunday." He glanced at her sideways. "Just saying you were going, not asking, not suggesting, just going." She considered this. "I needed to go," she said. "I just went." "I know," he said. "That's the thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I had stopped being able to do that, just go toward things. I was so—" he paused, choosing words. "Stopped. I didn't even know how stopped I was until you walked into that house and just kept moving, kept being present, kept doing the next thing. And the boys could see it before I could see it." She looked at his profile in the morning light, the clean jaw and the dark eyes and the particular way he held himself now that was different from the rigid containment of 5 years ago, looser, more inhabited. "You were not broken," she said. "You were grieving. Those are different." "I know that now," he said. She looked back at the yard, at Caleb now drawing something in the dirt with his stick to show James, at Sam pulling at the collar of Matthew's shirt with an experimental hand. "You were a good father through all of it," she said. "I want you to know I saw that, from the very beginning." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was gratitude and love in equal measure, and he put his arm around her, there in the church yard in front of the whole small population of Redemption, Texas, and she leaned into his side and let herself be held, which was something she had not been particularly good at before him, leaning on anything, but had learned. They drove home in the warm spring noon, all 6 of them, with the panhandle wind in their faces and the land going on in every direction to the flat horizon, and James fell asleep before they reached the ranch gate, and Eli had found Daniel in the crowd and arranged some future horse-related appointment that he was already narrating to Caleb, who was listening with half his attention and directing the other half at a sketch he was doing of the passing landscape. And Sam looked at everything with those bright, curious eyes. The ranch gate came into view. Matthew slowed the wagon to turn through it, and Nora looked at the house as they came up the track. The main house with its good roof and its kitchen garden, and the curl of smoke from the chimney where she had banked the morning fire, and the barn and the outbuildings and the history shelf through the parlor window and Caleb's drawings on the walls, and the whole full inhabited life that had grown up in this place in 5 years. She thought about the woman who had arrived here with a traveling trunk and a satchel full of books, and a heart carrying its own careful weight, and the man who had met her at the stage depot and looked at her for one long moment and then looked away, and the two boys who had been sitting in grief without quite knowing what to call it, and the church on the corner of First and Harper that had been waiting for all of them to find their way back. Matthew stopped the wagon at the house and handed Sam to Nora and climbed down and then turned back to lift her down too, his hands at her waist, steady as he had always been, and he held her for a moment before letting her feet touch the ground, looking at her in the noon light. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him, this man who had become the center of her life so thoroughly and so necessarily that she could no longer quite remember the geography of herself without him. "That I am very glad I went to church that morning," she said. He laughed. A real laugh, warm and complete, the kind he gave easily now, and it landed in the spring air, and the boys looked up from wherever they had scattered to, and Eli grinned and Caleb smiled in that private way he had, and James opened one eye from his sleep and then closed it again. "So am I," Matthew said. "So am I, Nora." He took her hand and they walked into their home together, into the smell of the banked fire and the books on the shelf, and the life they had built room by room and day by day. And the door closed behind them on the wide Texas afternoon, and everything was exactly and entirely as it should be. The seasons that followed were ones of growing and deepening, the ranch expanding in careful stages, the boys growing into themselves in ways that were sometimes surprising and always true to who they had always been. Caleb, at 17, sold his first reel painting to a gentleman passing through from San Antonio who stopped at the Redemption General Store and saw a piece Caleb had brought in on a whim, a view of the ranch at dawn that captured the particular quality of panhandle light in a way that made the man stop walking and stand for a full minute without speaking. He paid $12 for it and asked if there were more. There were more. There were always more. Caleb sent work to a gallery in San Antonio the following year and 3 pieces sold, and Nora watched Matthew's face when Caleb showed him the letter and saw in it the expression of a father who has seen his child arrive at himself. Eli, at 15, had become the finest young horseman in the county, with a patience and instinct for animals that was remarked on by everyone who witnessed it. He was thinking, he told them one evening at dinner, about horse breeding. About building something alongside the cattle ranch, a complementary enterprise, horses for the cavalry remount program, or for the working ranches that would always need good animals. Matthew listened to this with the full attention of a man who respects when someone has thought something through, and then asked a series of practical questions, and then said, "Let's look at the finances in the spring and see what's possible." It was possible. It became real. The Fairchild horse operation began small and built, with Eli's knowledge and Matthew's experience and Nora's careful bookkeeping, which she had taken over formally now that she understood the enterprise as deeply as anyone. James turned 5 and started learning his letters with the same comprehensive intensity he applied to everything, sitting at the kitchen table with his pencil gripped very hard and his tongue slightly out, producing letters of remarkable determination if variable legibility. He wanted to read as well as Nora and would accept no slower timeline. She taught him with the skill of an experienced teacher and the patience of a mother, and he made progress that surprised even her. Sam watched. Sam always watched. He would sit in his corner of the room with whatever object had currently captured his interest, examining it with methodical thoroughness, and then produce a question of such precise accuracy that everyone stopped to look at him. He was 3 years old and already asking questions that required real thought to answer, and Nora recognized in him the particular mind that needs extraordinary things to do with itself and began thinking, very quietly, about what the future might provide. In the fall of 1889, Nora told Matthew she thought she might be expecting again. He was in the barn when she found him, brushing down one of the horses after a long day, and she stood in the barn doorway with the late afternoon light behind her and told him. He stopped brushing, turned around, looked at her, Again, he said, and the word held everything, the wonder and the smallness and the gratitude. "I believe so," she said. He crossed the barn and took her hands, and she looked up at him in the dim, warm air that smelled of hay and horses and the particular comfort of a life well made. "A girl this time, maybe," he said. She tilted her head. "You think?" "I think it would be something to have a daughter," he said. She thought about this. "She would run this entire household before she was 5, she said. He grinned. "Good." He squeezed her hands. "More than good." The baby was born in the spring of 1890, the first genuinely warm day of March, and she was a girl. A small, determined girl with dark hair and her mother's steady brown eyes, who arrived in the world with a sureness of purpose that caused Mrs. Graves, now quite elderly but still presiding over the births of redemption with undiminished authority, to say she was the most confident infant she had encountered in 40 years of practice. They named her Clara. Nora had thought about this for a long time during the pregnancy, whether it was the right thing, whether it honored or complicated or both. She had talked to Matthew about it in the evenings, carefully and directly as they talked about everything. He had been quiet for a long time after she raised it, and then he had said, "I think she would have loved knowing she had a granddaughter, or whatever we call it." He paused. "A daughter of the house, a daughter of everything that came after." "Clara," Nora had said quietly. "Clara," he had agreed. So Clara Fairchild arrived in March of 1890, named for a woman she would never meet, and who had nonetheless made her possible, and was immediately claimed by all 4 of her brothers with the comprehensive territorial affection of boys who have decided that something belongs to them and intends to protect it accordingly. Caleb drew her portrait within her first week of life. Eli, who was by now 18 and dealing with the world in a capable and generous way, sat for hours with her in the evenings just looking at her. James, who was 6 and felt he had waited long enough for a sibling who wasn't much younger than him, immediately began reading to her as though she were already a student. Sam, 4 years old and as systematic as ever, was working on understanding her with the focused method he applied to everything. Matthew sat with his daughter in the evenings and talked to her, softly, the way he had always talked to his children, and Nora watched from across the room and felt the full weight of everything they had built together press into her chest in the best possible way. She thought sometimes, on the Sunday mornings when all 6 of them came down the stairs and got into the wagon and drove toward the white church and the clear windowed light, about the strange and particular way a life comes together. Not planned, not forced, but made, one small true choice at a time. She had chosen to answer an advertisement. She had chosen to be honest rather than merely agreeable. She had chosen, on one Sunday morning, to simply state what she was going to do and let the world respond. And the world had responded with Matthew Fairchild and his 2 careful boys, and a ranch on the edge of the Panhandle, and a history shelf that now held 23 books and 4 children, and a life that was everything she had not known to want and had discovered was exactly what she needed. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1891, they drove to church together as they always did, all 8 of them now, the wagon full, Clara in Nora's lap, Sam pressed close beside her, James in the back between his older brothers, Eli talking about the horses and Caleb quiet and sketching, and Matthew holding the reins with his characteristic steady focus, and glancing at her every few minutes with those warm eyes. The bell was ringing when they arrived, as it always was. Pastor Hale, who had grown older and more spare but whose eyes had not changed, stood at the door to greet the congregation as he always did. He shook Matthew's hand and nodded at the boys and looked at Clara in Nora's arms with a slow smile. "Full house," he said. "Always," Matthew said, and looked at Nora. They went inside into the morning light and the wood-end candle smell and the familiar plain pews, and they filled an entire pew now, which was a fact that still made Nora's heart do something complicated every time she thought about it. And she sat between her husband and her oldest son, and held her daughter and listened to the service, and felt the morning light through the clear windows on her face, and understood in the quietest and most fundamental way that she was home, completely, in every sense that the word could possibly hold. This was what she had come to Redemption, Texas for, though she had not known it then. This was the hidden motive she had not been aware of possessing, the one that had moved her toward a stage depot and a hard-jawed man in a good hat and two boys who had needed to see someone show up and keep showing up until showing up was simply what everyone did. She had shown up. He had opened. The boys had gotten dressed. And from that small Sunday morning beginning, everything good had followed, every joy and difficulty and deepening that made a life real rather than simply livable. And she had every reason to believe that what lay ahead was equally full, equally true, equally hers. Matthew's hand found hers on the pew. She held on. The bell above Redemption rang the last of its Sunday notes into the wide blue Texas sky, and the sermon began, and the Fairchild family sat together in the morning light, present and whole.